Today, of course, we're going to talk about the emotional face of firefighting, and essentially we're going to do that through the lens of the Black Saturday bushfires. And it's wonderful to see so many people from our emergency services, our police, our bushfire natural hazards cooperative research centre, and the broader community of emergency management practitioners here today to join. I'd also like to, first of all, acknowledge my two co-authors, Cynthia Hardy and Harry Tsoukas, who send their apologies for not being able to be here today. But we have Dr. Kobe Calix, my dear colleague from Uni New South Wales, who's going to facilitate the session, the Q&A at the end, and we're in such good hands there because Kobe has experience as a volunteer for the Eyre Peninsula fires and has also been a journalist reporting on firefighters as well. And like myself, has moved from that practitioner world into a research world to examine many of the issues that we live today, day to day with as emergency management practitioners. I'd also like to respectfully acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation from where I meet with you today. And in doing so, I acknowledge respectfully the elders past, present and becoming. And I extend the warmest of welcome to each and every one of you on this Friday afternoon. And I just want to also introduce myself a little bit more. I'm a lecturer at the Centre for Social Impact at Swinburne University, which is part of a national centre involving Uni New South Wales and the University of Western Australia. And today, which is one of the days of the week, which is International Volunteers Week, we as a centre acknowledge our volunteers, and we just want to say, we acknowledge you, we thank you, and we support you in whatever capacity. Today we stand with you and all of the organisations that support our volunteers, both in police, emergency services, education, all areas that we're actually examining and fascinated by, and we seek to make our community much better along with our volunteers. I'd also like to bring some attention to some of the incredible volunteer organisations that I've had the great privilege to work alongside during my career in emergency management. I came to Australia 18 years ago, and it's been fantastic to work with the emergency service organisations. Country Fire Authority remain such an incredible supporter of so much of my research, and we're very grateful for all of the volunteers and career staff who've contributed to the study today. State Emergency Service, Country Women's Association, the Community Emergency Responder Team of volunteer paramedics, Red Cross and Salvation. Today we acknowledge you and we say thank you. Today's presentation, we're going to look at the area of emotion. Emotion is part of all of our lives, and it's very much part of emergency management. And why is it important? Well, because emotion essentially is such a key part in the way that we make sense, the way that we make sense of so many of the emergencies that we see surrounding us on a day-to-day basis, from bushfire to pandemic, to road accident rescue, to chemical and hazard spills. Emotion plays a key role in the way that we make sense. And the way that we make sense actually prompts the way that we actually cope in our professional, everyday working lives. For the purposes of our study, emotion refers to the intense experiences that are elicited by a particular target or cause. That target or cause today is bushfire, and looking specifically at Black Saturday. And we see it often includes physiological as well as psychological reactions that gives rise to a series of action sequences. But it becomes far more fascinating when we consider that emotions are social. They're intersubjective constructions that acquire their meaning in a cultural setting, our setting, Victoria, in which they are situated, and they also influence the way in which they are displayed. So they're very much a subjective force that govern the way that we make sense and meaning and the actions that we take. And something that struck me a number of years ago, 3 years ago, was reading around the time of the anniversary of Black Saturday, our chief officer at the Country Fire Authority reflected on Black Saturday. And I was taken by very much the emotion that was in the words of that specific interview, where Steve says, the Black Saturday tragedy and the intense emotions that accompanied it had a profound impact on those in the CFA on that day. What I thought was very interesting to learn was that I reflect on it a lot, and seldom does a day pass that something about that day doesn't cross my mind. And what I realized that some of my own emergency management experience, you carry forward so many of the feelings and memories from specific types of events, whether you're in the incident control center, state coordination center, or whether you're a field officer, you carry forward so many of those feelings. And it may not even be apparent immediately after, it could be years after. And that's a very important point, because we see that emotions are very much fueling the way in which we make sense. And what is this notion of sense making? Well, this is a concept that is very prominent in organization studies, which is my discipline area. And it's made up of two components, the sensing component and the making component. So our emotions very much guide that sensing. They alert us to something in our environment that causes a particular type of reaction. And what we find is that the sensing part of sense making, it's very much grounded in our identity construction. So for example, it's very much informed by the nature of the work that we do, or even our own personal backgrounds. It's generally almost always retrospective. So we look backwards to make sense of what we experience in present moments. And that's very valid for the study that we did, because on Black Saturday, the experiences that served us so well to build community safety, there was a sense that there was something new in our landscape, something different in relation to the fire behavior of that day. When we move into the making component of sense making, we as humans, we always seek to enact sensible environments, environments that we're actually comfortable in. But of course, we know that is very rare, because quite often there's turbulence in the environment, or what we call equivocality. In making sense, it's always usually a social process between individuals or groups of individuals or teams. It's an ongoing process, and we focus and extract those cues from our environment, which we seek to bracket and frame before we take action. And it's always and everywhere more plausible than it will be accurate. So in the study that we're looking at, it's all about emotion and sense making. And we have three specific areas that we're interested in. The study of emotion in organization studies, and indeed sense making, is quite prominent, but it's very diffuse. And while there is a lot of focus on how temporary organizations come together as part of disasters, there's very little focus on what type of emotions emerge. So we're interested in what are the emotions which emerge from sense making after disasters. Are they negative? Are they positive? Or are they a combination of both? We know little of the emotional toll that disasters have on individuals, particularly those emergency management practitioners, and how it influences their sense making afterwards and the years ahead. And what we're interested in is, do individuals carry emotions from disasters into their future? And what effect does that emotional contagion have on sense making? The sense making that they do as they come in contact with the future types of emergencies that evolve. So what we did was we interviewed 67 people from across the emergency management community in Victoria. And we asked them to identify themselves, and you'll see there some people use their operational role, some people use their organizational role. And what that shows is that firefighting is a very complex type of activity. Yes, we see most visible our incredible firefighters in the field fighting the fires, the flames, but there's also a community of practitioners in incident control centers that we don't see so much, but each and every one is a firefighter in their own right. And what we did was we looked at the different tiers that sit within the structures of the organizations. We quite simplistically gave the label of senior managers, middle managers, and functional experts. But that doesn't reflect anything in relation to the leadership that was there amongst every one of these 67 participants. And it is indeed a huge privilege for me to be able to have interviewed these people and learn from their experiences. That was very hard gained experience. But my sense was that they shared that experience so that we can learn, so that we can start to open up the conversation around emergency management, that rather than point the finger and say, it's your responsibility or it's my responsibility, but we start to begin to open up and say it's our responsibility as a community. Community safety is everybody's responsibility, and we seek to achieve it as one. And in terms of this work that we've done, it sits within a suite of studies. First and foremost, we began with learning post-inquiry after the Black Saturday inquiry. What shape does learning play in emergency management? We've also looked at how it's almost difficult to start to reflect on learning because bushfire season happens every year and every fire event is different. And what we've seen with the most recent study about commemoration and remembrance in relation to bushfire events is that we haven't lived long enough to be able to know what the future holds. And they're very important words that were first uttered by Judge Leonard Stretton in 1973. And what's emerging is that there's this sense that our firefighters want all of us to take more responsibility, that it's almost an uncomfortable mantle to be called a hero, because what it's doing is absolving so many of us from actually taking responsibility for community safety. Insofar as if we live in a bushfire prone area, it is so important that we have a bushfire plan. But we'll talk about more of that because I think that's also very relevant to the COVID-19 discussion. I've got taken a lot of questions recently around what does your research mean for COVID-19 or future bushfires? And when I reflect on it, I feel it's everything. Yes, we learn how we can actually help our emergency services so much better by being active participants in our community. But the research also means nothing because every event is very different, as we've seen with the fires that most recently passed this current season. So in terms of looking at our case study, many of us are all too familiar with Black Saturday. It was essentially a day of 15 fires over a 30-minute period that resulted in the loss of 173 lives. 3 townships almost completely razed, many people left homeless, and extreme amounts of damage. And what we did in terms of analysing our data was that we could see that there were 3 practice worlds at work here: responding to the fires itself, responding to a bushfire Royal Commission, and then having to take the findings of that Royal Commission and implement and change organisations for the future. And what we found was that was a very highly emotional context, as we'll see as we explore these findings. So there's our 3 practice worlds. First and foremost, responding to the fires. Secondly, an account-giving world. And then returning to organisations to say, well, what does all that mean? Findings, recommendations, and major fires. And what we saw was that the emotions were quite intense even before leading up to the fires. And many of us who are in the webinar today will recall, and it's reflected by some of the findings, as one person shared, when we analysed the data that week leading up to Black Saturday, it exceeded everything we had known before. Everything about the day was going to be worse. But it actually was worse again when we see how those temperatures soared. So straight away, there was quite a lot of anxiety and stress leading up to Black Saturday. But what's interesting, if we hold that thought about anxiety, because that actually has a key role in performance, as we'll see later on. During the fires, during that performing practice world, it was extraordinarily difficult for our firefighters, as it would have been in the most recent fires and the fires that would have happened in the lead up to Black Saturday and long before. But what I thought was was very moving was to hear the story of one particular brigade captain. The hardest things I had to do on Black Saturday was pick a crew. They're going to see things that will leave an impression for the rest of their lives. Your last thought as you send them off is, am I going to see these people again? You wonder later if your decision is adding layers of trauma onto residual trauma they have had from 30 years previously. So what we see is that people who, volunteers and career staff who fought the fires on Black Saturday, some would have even fought fires during Ash Wednesday. But even in between that period, I've been here in Australia for 18 years, and almost every one of those 18 years, there have been very significant fire events. And as people have told me, just because it doesn't materialize in our landscape, it doesn't mean that that threat isn't always there. So again, anxiety is such a key part of what is part of being a firefighter, whether you're in an incident control center or whether you're out in the field. In the immediate aftermath, people were experiencing lots of difficult emotions. People who were private citizens, work colleagues of others, had lost their lives because they were members of the community. As one person pointed out to me, this is the name of a person, wife, name of a person, husband. I knew them. They died in Black Saturday, which was very sad. Also, many people were seeing the updates every day. And as one person shared, each day there'd be new updates of the deaths. You get into your car at the end of each shift and just cry. There was fear everywhere. The fires could blow up again. We all felt guilt, even though it wasn't us who caused the fires. So again, some very intense emotions that our firefighters were experiencing. But remember, Black Saturday was just one day of what was an extraordinarily complex fire season. So while it was Black Saturday was as difficult as it was, there was always that fear that the fires could blow up again. And it was still a very, very difficult fire season. But there was also another layer of complexity. As somebody talked about, there was this anticipation of a Royal Commission where they knew they were going to have to go into this account-giving world. And as one person shared their experience, I don't think there's anything more profoundly sad than to be confronted by the facts of what happened on Black Saturday. The second most confronting thing is to have to equip yourself for a Royal Commission process. Because we know in emergency management that the review processes can be very difficult to experience. But let us hope that this is one of the great learnings from Black Saturday, that we never go through a Royal Commission as it was for Black Saturday. Because what we saw during the Royal Commission was this account-giving practice world was very, very difficult for people to relive so much of what they had experienced. And we also saw some emotions such as anger. As one person commented, it made me so angry. They were crucified because they didn't get the messages out. They couldn't have done any better, but they're absolutely slaughtered by this Royal Commission. And that's very moving and very powerful, and particularly in our current context, because we see we can't expect our firefighters to be superheroes, as they're commonly referred to. And would it be appropriate or fair to blame our chief health officer for the pandemic as we see it at the moment? I think not. Again, we could see also so many people had experienced incredibly traumatic events. Some of these people had lost their houses. They lost people they knew. They lost family members, but they were still continuing firefighting. The Royal Commission wasn't very sensitive at all. So here we see this account-giving world that was incredibly difficult for many of our emergency management practitioners. But then there was to return to the organizational world where they had to actually make sense not only of the fires themselves, but also of what were extraordinary complex recommendations that took quite a significant amount of deliberation to arrive at. And I thought it was very powerful what one person said. Quite clearly, the Royal Commissioners were captured by the emotion of what had occurred. as he commented, they were captured by the emotion of the tragedy, as we all were. We all carry the scars and will do for the rest of our lives. After Black Saturday, the Victorian community needed a person who could sympathetically but dispassionately say, well, what's really going on here? Taking a step back from what had occurred so that we can actually reflect on what it actually means, that we can actually make sense of it in a way that means something for everybody. But what we did see from some of the people who participated in the study was, in actual fact, there was some positive emotions started to emerge as people came back into a more settled environment and started to reconnect with colleagues and peers. And indeed, it overcame some of the frustrations that they felt for many years as part of working in the sector. As one person commented, it catalyzed things. It brought so many things forward that we felt and you should be looked at, whether we liked it or not. As another person commented, with the Fire Commissioner, now the Emergency Management Commissioner, we see there's one person to report to and who is in charge. And we can see a lot of that change quite visible in the season that just passed, where we see daily briefings. That is not to say they didn't happen before, but they're actually much more visible now. And finally, it was the Royal Commission missed many things, but as we implemented many of its findings, our confidence and knowledge grew in our ability to deliver change. So people reconnecting again with their practice as practitioners to be able to influence change for a safer society and safer community. However, and this is very, very prominent in a lot of the studies that I've done over the past couple of years, people talk about the worry of the future. We've not lived long enough to know what can actually occur. And as one person talked about, each time you go into the State Control Centre, it's like you walk past a ghost. I get anxious just walking in there and doing my role. So there's a little bit of post-traumatic stress that translates into anxiety, where I double check everything I'm doing. So while this emotion of anxiety is very important for performing, it is actually difficult as an emotion to make sense of. And it wears over time. There's no doubt about that. So what have we seen? Well, through the lens of the Black Saturday bushfires, it's an intensely emotional experience. And we see that anxiety is very prominent even before leading up to Black Saturday, but that can be any event or before attending any event, that there's that stress. There's a high degree of sadness. There was more anxiety in anticipation of announcement of a Royal Commission, further stress to have to live through that experience. And then the anger and shock that came as a result of some of the very difficult judicious cross-examinations that occurred as part of the Black Saturday Royal Commission, that left people with the sense of guilt. However, when they returned to some form of a normal environment, you could see that there was trust and confidence amongst people, and even a degree of happiness that some of the changes that they had been grappling with for many years, that they were able to now use recommendations to actually move forward. But as we see, anxiety returns, and from fire season to fire season, we know that every fire event, and indeed every emergency management event, is very different, despite the experience that we might accumulate. So how does that look in terms of what we're trying to do in a theoretical world, migrating into practice? Well, what we see is that there is a high level of existential anxiety in that performing part. And that gives rise to sense making. But when it doesn't, we see that people experience a lot of meaningless through tragedy. But where they can actually experience the anxiety, make sense, they can cope at least from minute to minute, hour to hour in response to the event, where they can use their knowledge. But as they move into that account giving world, you see that again, the representation is sometimes miscued. They become worried. And sometimes that can give rise to silencing and blaming. and it leads to this sense of paralysis. But theoretically, they can cope and build new abstract knowledge and move into a reorganized world where they can start to practice again. But that practice gives rise to its own form of anxiety as we reflect on the future. So what we're seeing is emotion. It gives rise to a sort of sense making and a sort of coping. And as I draw to a conclusion of the presentation, something that I find very powerful is artwork. And it was brought to my attention really through some correspondence with communities in Mount Beauty who come together and use artwork as a form of art therapy to reflect on bushfire events. But this one just over a month ago in the Canberra Times, I think is very important for us as we reflect on COVID-19. And as the artist Mike Ashley talked in the Canberra Times, I was concerned that the bushfire relief and those affected may have been forgotten as we move from one headline to another. And again, this is very important, that we have to acknowledge that so much happens in the world of emergency management that we need to remember, that we need to acknowledge, that we can't forget. Because as soon as we forget, we kind of fall back into some of the old ways that might give rise to harm. And I think we have to be very careful as well. What we're seeing is this valorization of our emergency services. And what we're seeing through COVID-19 is a valorization of our medical staff. And we're seeing this desire to create heroes. But a colleague of mine at the University of Limerick in Ireland is doing quite a big empirical piece of work that's showing that these people are uncomfortable with being called heroes, because again, it absolves us all in the community from what we can do in terms of our own, of achieving community safety. For example, we can all work together with friends and family and see, well, what do we need to do to ease the burden on some of our emergency services? And I think we've seen that in COVID-19, where we recognize that our actions can make a huge difference in community safety. And I'd like to just conclude, and really I acknowledge today that there's so many here from Victoria Police. Just over a month ago, we lost 4 people from the community of police and emergency services. And I really want to see that we learn and we review these events in a much more compassionate and human kind of way. Because as our Deputy Commissioner Shane Patton commented when talking about how we're coping and how people coped on that evening on the freeway, and what he commented was, it's so traumatic for our first responders who turned up. That's not just police, that's the firefighters, paramedics, not to mention the array of contractors. You don't get over these kinds of scenes. They actually stay with you for the rest of your life. There's something you have to live with. It's something that will never leave them. So let's as a community reflect on what we can do to ease the burdens on so much of what our police and emergency services do. I'd like to thank you for taking the opportunity to come and listen about the study today. I'm always available to share and talk through some more of what we're finding in our research. And I'd like to pass over to Kobe to facilitate a discussion. And please, this is your session. Don't hesitate to become involved in the questions. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Graham.
Thank you, Kobe.
It's a really important framing to have, kind of thinking about the emotional side of these kind of things. I just wanted to clarify that I was an ABC journalist based on the Eyre Peninsula after the 2005 fatal fires there, where I spent months interviewing emergency services workers and people after the fires, but I didn't train as a firefighter until years after that with the CFS.
My apologies, Kobe, thank you.
No, that's all right. I encourage people to ask questions, otherwise I can start off with a couple of questions for Graham, but I do know that we have a lot of people from the emergency services in the chat. And so I guess you're among colleagues if you did want to ask any questions, and keen to hear from other people as well on the call. I was certainly emotionally affected by my experiences reporting on bushfire recovery, which shaped me working later for the CFS. And I've also trained later as a Red Cross emergency volunteer and done psychological first aid training. So I'm a lot more equipped in that space now than I was then. And I can definitely relate to the feelings of anxiety that you're talking about in terms of working in the incident control centre and documenting everything that I did in that space, knowing that inquiry might review my logs.
I remember also, Kobe, I was a general firefighter for a couple of years at the department, what's now called the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. Back then, the Department of Sustainability and Environment. And during fire season, I remember packing the go bag and having it under the desk. And it's that anxiety, wondering, will I have to go? And that disruption in terms of what my lifestyle is. And then when you go and you actually see how dangerous it can be to be around flame on the landscape as well, and some of the incidents that occur on the landscape, it sometimes can affect, as it does for me, like I reflect on it quite regularly in the same way that Steve Warrington commented at the start of the presentation in relation to Black Saturday. So it is very much, I find, an emotional context, and that's what Cynthia and Harry and I are trying to unpack a little bit.
Yeah. And I'm interested in how people move across organisations and take that organisational knowledge between organisations. But also, certainly in some contexts I'm familiar with, like for example on the Eyre Peninsula and KI, for example, where you have formal fire trucks alongside kind of farm units and things like that. And I wonder, in terms of who you interviewed in the study, you were, I guess, looking for people that were within emergency services formal organisations. But I wonder if within communities, in the work you've done with communities, you're kind of looking at people who were acting as firefighters within the community, or maybe stayed to defend and then got quite involved, you know, potentially working directly with firefighters to defend their properties, as distinct to people who maybe evacuated and then came back, or had less of a, you know, fire front, I guess, experience at all.
Yeah. Sorry, I missed a part of that there. Was there a question there, Kobe, you had for me?
Sorry, actually it ties in nicely with a question that someone's asked in the chat.
Yes.
So I'll ask that more directly, which was, how many firefighters and personnel did you interview? And have you kept in touch and connected subsequently with any of them? Because yeah, you're talking about building relationships, and so whether that's built relationships that you maintain.
So I interviewed, it was 92 people, and I used 67 of those interviewees for the purposes of the study. And yes, I still am in very regular contact with many of those people, because not only have they expressed a great interest in the importance of this work in relation to post-traumatic stress, but they're also interested in how this work is shared across the sector, and how, just trying to unpack a little bit more around what it means. So 67 people from across the Victorian Emergency Management Service community, and they have continued to be involved in the projects that I'm doing, the current one being the one on commemoration and remembrance around Black Saturday. And what I'm seeing there is that there is very much this cycle of emotionality and equivocality that people even continue to carry 10 years after Black Saturday. And a lot of people coming forward and reflecting on post-traumatic stress that they've lived with for 10 years, that in some ways can be attributed to Black Saturday, but can also be attributed to so much of the work that people do in emergency management. So it's a complex type of area.
Yeah, and we're getting a few questions in about that now. So the first of those was, what does your research mean for the development of psychological strategies for emergency management personnel, and whether you think that we can improve on programs available for personnel?
I think, well, I'm not a psychologist or a clinical psychologist, but what we're interested in primarily is people's emotions when in reaction to specific types of events. And where I think it can inform is in the area of peer support and health and well-being strategies. And that's very much something that is the next stage of what I would like to do, is to maybe bring it through the Emergency Management Commissioner's office and reflect on what's the best way to share this into the sector and build in some of the various findings around the emotions that people experienced and how we actually deal with those. I think as well, for those participants who know me quite well, I've got a real interest in how we do review processes, because I feel a great level of frustration that we spend so much money on things like Royal Commissions, when probably the most powerful review process that, in my view, and it really is just my opinion, was after Ash Wednesday, where it was a review committee that was appointed of experts. So it took away that cross-examined judicious type process, and it resulted in change that really is still at the bedrock of so much emergency management policy here in Victoria today. So I think from talking to people who lived through that process, they found that quite cathartic, where they found that because there was that trust with the people who were in charge of the committee, they actually had a much more rich and meaningful learning outcome, as well as a healing outcome for people who had lived through very difficult fires.
Yeah, and you've touched on the answer potentially to this next question, which is about your thoughts on working in this sector where most people have some form of trauma. And do you have other thoughts to add about how this impacts on how we evolve and work well together?
I think from what I can see most strongly in the most recent project on commemoration and remembrance, it's actually acknowledging it first and foremost. I think it's acknowledging the fact that trauma is such a big part of what we live with as emergency management practitioners, and seeking to open up that discussion rather than close it down, and seeking to acknowledge our own feelings first, that this might be something that we're experiencing, and seeking help for it. And I know that's it's almost like stating the obvious, but that's come through very loud and clear. And there's a number of participants who commented as part of that project who said they almost fought it for years. They knew things weren't quite right, but it was actually a great relief to acknowledge it, almost to pull it out from the long grass and see it for what it is, and start to then be able to live with it, work with it, and understand that there's nothing wrong to actually feel, to carry something like post-traumatic stress.
Yeah, which links into the question about whether you could talk a bit about practical things in handling these experiences and continuing to live and work, particularly when these experiences might accumulate through multiple events.
I'm conscious that, I'm not in the front line anymore of emergency management, but I think there's many people who are in the webinar today that can probably speak to that, Kobe, if anybody would be willing to talk a little bit around it. But again, I just go back to the honesty of acknowledging that this is something that's in the sector, and that we should always be cognizant of it, that working in an environment with the type of work that we do, that emergency management practitioners do, is highly stressful and is highly difficult, and you live with some very difficult emotions. And particularly when you see that there's this move to sometimes normalize what people live through, and that's something that we probably want to move away from and even avoid, because we can't normalize it. They're difficult experiences, and they will happen again in the future.
Yeah, and there's definitely people sharing their experiences and expertise in the chat now. One of those is someone pointing out that CFA is rightly proud that they didn't lose a single firefighter in Black Saturday.
Yes.
But some people would rather that number included those who took their own lives in the weeks and months that followed. And certainly that was a big focus of my reporting post the Eyre Peninsula fires. There's a lot of focus on mental health and
absolutely
suicide. So do you have any thoughts on this, and if these deaths should be acknowledged alongside those that lose their lives directly in the line of service?
Well, that's something that, again, I'm working through in the current project, because I think how we acknowledge is is a very delicate and sensitive area, because people are carrying post-traumatic stress, and to be acknowledging and remembering in a way that's insensitive causes a great level of care. And I mean, I've such sympathy for the community of firefighters when I hear those stories of people taking their own lives, and they're often forgotten in the process of remembering. And that's something that we shouldn't. I don't have the answer for that, and I don't even know if there is an answer for something like that, because it's ultimately about support, it's about care, it's about well-being, it's about sharing, it's about finding where those vulnerabilities are within our sector, and it's really encouraging the nurturing of those support mechanisms. And this is really just my perspective, Kobe, but again, I'd say there's people who are living through a lot of what we're discussing here now in the webinar.
Have you seen a shift in how people have been willing to share their experiences?
Insofar as the research process, it's been extraordinary to hear the stories of people talking about how, again, I've mentioned they fought it for years, but now there's actually much more of a culture, as we talked about the cultural context of emotions, where you can come forward and that there will be support there. And that's quite powerful to hear in the interview process, where people talk about how they wish they had have taken those steps 10 years earlier in terms of the difference that it would have made. And now what they're doing is they become an agent of that change within their organization, where they can see those signs of colleagues who are experiencing difficulties, and they can work with them in an informal sense before seeking that formal support. And again, I think it just shows the power of always being able to acknowledge the cues, making sense of some of those cues that exist all around us, and not just necessarily in emergency service organizations, even though it's much more acute there.
Yeah, and certainly psychological first aid training being rolled out across Australia over the last decade, and the training available in that space, I think, has helped. Certainly it's helped kind of in my workplaces. Have you seen a difference between those working and volunteering in response versus recovery?
It seems I can't quite see a difference specifically, but I think what I picked up from some of the volunteers that I've spoken to is just some of those challenges that I guess are perennial in a way, because they're not only responding to the fire, they're also have their own businesses or their own career where they're taking leave from to fight the fires, etc., and they struggle with that. And I think, again, because many of the volunteers actually live and work in the communities that they respond to fire events, they feel that quite acutely when there's this sense of guilt or blame, and that's quite difficult for them to live through. But I also think in many that I've seen that in the research with the career firefighters as well. It's no less pronounced, the difficulty. In terms of dedicated response workers, I think I've had interaction with people who dealt with the recovery after Lancefield, and I think there was definitely parallels and congruity there in terms of the experiences that they feel around many of the emotions that we talked about as well in the presentation.
So I want to take a moment. Rhonda mentioned that if anyone would like to speak, you can let us know here in your chat. I'm also going to have a pause myself. We've still got about 10 minutes left. So if you'd like to speak in asking a question now, I'm just going to have a pause into that, and then we'll move into a slightly different question. So now is an opportunity, if you wanted to ask something on audio, then go for it. Or if that's now feeling a bit too much pressure, then feel free to write it down in the chat.
Sure.
And I'll move on to a slightly different question that we had, but by all means we can come back to more on the threads we've covered so far if people feel like they now want to share something. Someone asked about whether you have thoughts on how what you've learned, I guess, through the bushfires has played out in the healthcare sector, both here and overseas, with what we're seeing now with the pandemic.
Yeah, well, again, I tried to allude to it in the presentation, Kobe. I think we think that there's always going to be a fire truck there to make a difference or to save our property. I think there's so much that we can do as a community to help our emergency services. If we know of friends that we have who speed on our roads, we need to tell our friends to stop speeding. If we know of somebody who lives in a bushfire-prone area who doesn't have a plan, then please make a plan, work with their local emergency services, see ourselves as an active agent in promoting community safety, because that was something that I picked up from a lot of people that I spoke with, that there's so much that the community can actually do, and that was perhaps something that they would have liked to have seen a bit more of reflection on in something like the Royal Commission. I think what we've seen with COVID-19 is just again how powerful it is, that the role that we can play in terms of following the advice of the Chief Health Officer that can stop the spread of the pandemic. And I think the same applies for so many of the different types of emergency events that surround the community more generally.
Yeah, and I think particularly this season in Australia, we've seen how disasters have converged and how that's putting more pressure on volunteers. Absolutely. And I'm very aware that in rural communities, there are people who act in both roles, who are trained firefighters as well as ambulance workers, for example.
Absolutely.
Do you have any thoughts on, there's a bit in the media at the moment about, regional travel opening in some places, and there's been talk about, the risks of people traveling into regional communities who are not from there. So there's a sense that communities will often kind of band together and support each other and can do that, but then, people can come in, and sometimes that's been associated with causing bushfires and things like that. And certainly there's a fear that people could come in and spread coronavirus. Did you kind of touch on that sense of kind of who is in the community and then people coming in? And there's lots of good emotional stuff about solidarity and kind of that in group.
Yeah, it's difficult, Colby. I mean, I think as we see that there's so much globally that for me, it prompts that we just need to become so much aware of the context that we find ourselves within, because there's so much access to knowledge through so many different kinds of formats that it's not knowing is not an excuse anymore. So I think that's best I can really offer, I guess, is knowledge is key with so much of this, and there's so much incredible knowledge out there to be able to be leveraged for all of us, that we can broker it into our everyday practices of where we go and how we behave and what we do.
Yeah. We've still got another 5 minutes or so for questions, so if you've had one in mind, now is a great time to share it. Nick asked, is there anything that the general public could be doing to advocate for our emergency workers? And what could this look like, noting that, for example, there's some backlash in the UK about clapping for the NHS, for example. So I guess given your more recent research is about commemorating and reflecting, what are your thoughts on that?
About what we can do? I mean, again, it's that's probably something that so many of the participants in the webinar here today would be much better informed to reflect on. But I think, I mean, what people did share with me was how for the Black Saturday commemorative event that occurred at the exhibition centre here in town, was that there was a real reluctance for people to go, and that while the ceremony in and of itself didn't really speak to a lot of their experience, what was very powerful and was very meaningful was to reconnect with people after some time and to have that time and space afterwards where they commune themselves and informally reflect on what they had lived through and where their lives are at now was very, very important. So I think the more we can provide those opportunities, but my sense too is that brigades work well within themselves. From some of the people that I spoke to, like that they actually have, they remember in their own way, and I think we should never try and interfere with that. And I think probably just be so much more cognizant of it when it comes to remembering different types of events, that the remembrance belongs to the people who've lived through the experience.
Yeah. Yeah. So we still have actually there's another question that's come in. Have new guidelines for Royal Commissions been established since the Black Saturday one, which addresses the inevitable desire to find a problem to fix? Ensures it's done in a way that respects that everyone is usually doing their imperfect best.
It's very interesting. There was, and many people would probably be aware of it, but there were 67 recommendations as part of the Black Saturday Royal Commission. The very final recommendation, number 67, was to actually look at how we conduct Royal Commissions after events like Black Saturday. But I could be wrong, but my reading of the bill that went through Parliament that became an act, it didn't really offer anything that's not there already, insofar as we can use a Royal Commission, we can use a review board, or we can use a type of a panel. So my hope is that we move away from this politicization of these types of events, and that's why I was quite heartened to see our Victorian government after the fires really promoting, leveraging some of that continuous improvement, reflection and learning, rather than going down the path of something like a Royal Commission. Because I think once you go down a Royal Commission pathway, you're saying something is wrong or somebody has to be accountable, and making somebody accountable is almost the same side of the coin as blaming.
Yeah.
So there has been work done, and maybe my reading of the situation is that our Premier was aware of that and has chosen to leverage that by not going down the road of a Royal Commission.
Yeah. We probably have time to squeeze in this other question about the use of the word hero, which you've touched on a couple of times. Do you think
Yes.
it's an additional stressor or places a sense of obligation on people?
It's very interesting, Colby. That conversation article, there was probably in excess of 500 comments about that particular topic. And it was, what people were saying was that, yes, it gets used a lot by the media, but in actual fact, it doesn't serve us, because there's a sense that heroes are sometimes mavericks, and mavericks don't necessarily follow the types of protocols, processes, and safety procedures that go so far to keeping our firefighters safe. So I think there's a real reluctance to be using it, but that's not to say that people that our firefighters don't do the most incredible work. I think there is a reluctance to be labelled as a hero, and that's even coming through from the work that my colleague is doing at the University of Limerick in Ireland. That there's a lot of people who work in supermarkets who've responded and said that quite often they just like people to express common decency and say thank you each time at the register, rather than reading about a journalist referring to them as the heroes that work in supermarkets, etc.
Yeah. Thank you so much for everybody who's contributed questions. And I recognise that we have delved into some topics that some people might find distressing. If you wanted to talk to someone now or later tonight, reflecting on some of this, you can call Lifeline on 131114. I'm also going to share just now in the chat the Beyond Blues resources related to the current emergency, which are a bit more diverse in terms of there's forums, there's also resources that can help you in talking to other people about how they're feeling about things, like for example updating a suicide safety plan. A lot of people in emergency services are aware of bushfire planning and how that can really make a difference. So there's also these kind of things in the mental health space. Thank you so much for participating today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah. And please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or any of us in the centre, because it's your webinar and it's your data to a large degree. So we really want to hear your reflections on how this can transpose into practice, and the most appropriate way in terms of how it can transpose into practice as well. So thanks a million. I really appreciate everybody taking the time to come and be with us today.